Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started to try to keep things on time. Welcome again, everyone, to Brain School, the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute Brain School that's part of Brain Awareness Week. As you've heard me say the last few nights, sponsored by the Dana Brain Alliance, Dana Foundation, and also the Society for Neuroscience. We're really excited to see everybody here. It's been a great week so far, and will be no less this evening. Just to remind everybody, we have Kids Night tonight, and at the very beginning, we've had a bunch of displays downstairs. I think there still may be a bunch of kids down there, which is great. You don't have to be any particular age to be a kid. All of you are kids, so you can hang out and play with some of the demos. In addition, there are graduation certificates on the desks downstairs. And for those of you, I think, who signed up, we have the certificates for everybody that are signed that you can have framed and hopefully use it to get a raise at work, or something good will happen in your life being a graduate of Brain School. So please make sure to pick those up. We also have a little questionnaire that I hope was given to you on the way in. If not, you could get one on the way out. Just a few brief questions to answer. We'd love to get your feedback on what you thought about Brain School and ideas, if you have them, about how we might improve it in future years as well. So without further ado, we're going to launch into tonight's program. Tonight's program, we heard some tough things the first night about addiction and the opioid epidemic, and some hard things about what's going on, dealing with some major problems that affect our health and our communities, and hopefully some good news about innovative new research and potential treatments and therapies. Last night we heard some scary stuff about little things that get into our brain, like brain-eating amoeba and toxoplasmosis gondii and schistosomiasis and some other things. And that was a lot of fun. I know it got a lot of people's attention. And tonight, we're going to get on a more positive aspect of the brain, more on what we call the augmentation side. Depending on how you look at it, everything has its risks and benefits, and we'll try to talk about some of those. And everybody in this room is well aware of these and all the other stuff we're all hooked up to. And as I like to say to my friends and colleagues, we are currently running the biggest uncontrolled experiment in the history of mankind. That is, we are raising a generation of people from day one who are tied into all these devices. What will happen on the other end of their brains and behavior, we don't yet know. But stay tuned, we'll find out in a few decades. Anyway, it'd be interesting to know something about it, and it'd be interesting to know something about the power of connectivity between living brains and machines, devices, and so forth. We're going to tonight hear a variety of perspectives. The moderator for tonight's panel will be Dr. Stephen LaConte. Dr. LaConte is an associate professor at the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute and the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Mechanics in the College of Engineering at Virginia Tech. He did his doctoral work in biomedical engineering at the University of Minnesota, postdoctoral training at Emory and Georgia Tech, and then joined the faculty at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston in the department that I ran there, and moved here with us to be one of the founders of the VTCRI. Dr. Audra Van Wart will be running a part of the program as well tonight. Dr. Van Wart did her doctoral training in neurobiology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She did postdoctoral work at MIT, and after that time, she went into the publishing industry and was an associate editor for one of the world's premier journals on brain research called Neuron. And then luckily for us, we recruited her here to the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute, where she serves, as the Assistant Vice President for Health Science Education and as the Director of Educational and Training Initiatives at the VTCRI as well. So she's very involved and very knowledgeable from the educational perspective on these issues. And then we have Dr. Bob Trestman, who many of you met the other night in the first panel, who's agreed graciously to come back and do a repeat for us. Dr. Trestman is the chair and professor of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine at the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and at Carilion Clinic. He did work, graduate work, got a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Tennessee. Also did his medical degree at the University of Tennessee, then residency in psychiatry in New York at Mount Sinai. He was then at the University of Connecticut, where he chaired the psychiatry department and was very involved with that state's mental health care in the correctional system throughout Connecticut before being recruited to join our group a year ago now, maybe, Bob? It's not that long, but it seems like forever. Having fun. And then we also have, from a different perspective, Sheila Umberger here. Sheila is the director of the Roanoke Library system. She's a recipient, I think, last year of the Sullivan Award for Public Library Administrators for work on supportive services to children. She did her undergraduate work at the University of Kentucky and did her master's in library science at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. So it's great to have you here as well, Sheila. And we are talking about development in kids, and so we have a kid here. I'm sorry to call you a kid. We have a student here. Erik Scarlatescu is here from Hidden Valley School and also the Governor's School. He's a 10th grader, I believe. Is that right, Erik? And Erik is a very accomplished young man who is very good and very talented at dealing with a lot of the things and the technologies we're talking about tonight. And I think it'll be fascinating to get some perspective from you as well, Erik. So it should be a fun night. I want to make it interactive, and I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. LaConte to get us going. Steve?
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to turn on this microphone. Okay, everyone can hear me? Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Mike, and I'd like to especially thank the panelists for being here, being flexible with the snow days, and thank you, Audra Van Wart, for helping me keep this organized. Any organizational aspect of this, Audra. Any disorganizational, me. So, just to stimulate the conversation, I thought that I'd start with some brief opening remarks, and then we'll kind of see how the discussion goes, and then to wrap things up and bookend it, Audra Van Wart is going to make a few final comments to make sure that we reach our goals of making this a brain school proper lecture or session. So just this afternoon, I did a quick Google search on, oops, this isn't advancing, on digital devices. And so this is anyone, the irony is anyone here probably can also replicate the search right now on their cell phones. But Google clusters this search into lots of different categories. And one thing, you know, not to kind of overstate it, but technological advancements seem to be unstoppable and inevitable. And that, I think, is a part of the human story. But we're in a unique situation today, I think, where every generation is, their children are seeing increasingly more different landscape than the parents that were raising them. This is my opinion, but I think that the change from radio to TV, for example, or the change from black and white to color TV is far outpaced by the changes when I was kind of high school, college age, of terminal-based email and dial-up modem bulletin boards, if people remember that, to today's landscape of smartphones and social media. So I think social media is going to play a really important role probably in tonight's conversation. And because it's Brain School, I'd like to start with kind of a quiz. Now, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but these are kind of the icons of our society at this point. So how many people know what, or don't raise your hand, but say out loud, what is this? Okay. Good. Better than I would do. Good. 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 Yes, good. Good job. Twitch, good. My favorite, very interesting Twitch. We can come back to Twitch if someone wants to ask a question about Twitch. So, you know, social media is something that allows for the formation of online communities by enabling people to share information, ideas, opinions, messages, videos. And it seems to be kind of an unstoppable force. And when we tie this back into Brain School and think about how do cognitive neuroscientists think about this, well, one of our tools as scientists is to think about things in a kind of a reductionist framework. And so there isn't a lot of literature out here. This was actually a paper that Doug Chan in my lab brought to my attention, but it's only one of a handful. And one of the things that this group, which is a collaborative group from Princeton and Berlin, were looking at were kind of how do you break down the behaviors in social media? And so they broke it down into 5 behaviors. The first is broadcast. Let me use the other one. The first is broadcast. The other is receive feedback, observe, provide feedback, and compare. And like I said, there isn't a lot of literature out there right now, but based on these sorts of things, we can make initial guesses about the brain networks that are likely involved for these different tasks. And so, for example, in blue, you can think of a so-called, what the authors call a mentalizing network, which includes dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, temporal parietal junction, anterior temporal lobe, inferior frontal gyrus, posterior cingulate, or PCC, in the back here. It's kind of this one is covered up by the red network, which overlaps. They call the red network the self-referential network, which is the medial prefrontal cortex, and again, the posterior cingulate. And the green network they've labeled as ventral, the reward network, which includes ventral medial prefrontal cortex, ventral striatum, and ventral tegmental area. So technology is also having vast repercussions on our psychology, our intelligence and cognition, and even our physical well-being. And so there's a growing role of technology in clinical practice. And as a group, one of the things that we may want to discuss is, how does this change clinical practice? But also, as parents and children and clinicians, what do we think about navigating the right balance between a good amount or too much screen time or device time? And what's it like to be a grandparent, for that matter? Are grandchildren harder to relate to these days because they're stuck in their devices? Or, on the other hand, are they really great technical support when they come over and they can help us get our internet back up and running? So what should we be thinking about along these lines? And, the other kind of health issue that may come up tonight would be things around addiction related to things like video games and too much internet connectivity. Actually, I'm a slide. Yeah, there we go. This is a somewhat outdated study that's looking at, from 2013, looking at so-called techno-sapiens. So this is a survey of 1,400 young people ages 16 to 25. And you can kind of see some of the summary things. 98% at the time were internet users. 67% used the internet after 11 p.m. Although the number of hours doesn't seem super extreme, average of less than 4 hours a day. And you can read some of the rest, and we could bring that back up if people are interested. So technology is an amazing tool for learning and sharing. And so, for example, through YouTube, I can look like a genius because I know how to change the spark plugs on my car because I've seen someone else do it with that exact make and model. So you can learn to do almost anything. But what does this mean socially for children that don't have full access to technology? And how are library systems and public schools helping to address these issues? Oops. And so here are some really neat pictures of some proposed work that are happening here in Roanoke, and some actual spaces set for children here in Roanoke, as well as I think we might hear from Sheila about some applications that are really important and kind of up and coming in terms of child development, as well as interaction with children and getting them out of the apps and into the actual world environment around them. One of the things we might ask Erik about is, how can we encourage our children to learn to program computers? He's fluent in several really tough programming languages, C++, Python, I think you do Java, is that correct? And he's been doing that since 4th grade, and I've looked at his code, and he's extremely proficient and professional in terms of that development. We will hear from Audra Van Wart tonight about some of the consequences of being so physically close to our devices, especially at nighttime, and the issues of blue light exposure and repercussions on sleep and circadian rhythm. And then, well, Erik was supposed to provide me with a selfie, but since Mike already introduced everybody, I think that we can open it up first to the floor, and then I'll just kind of steer things along and make sure that we have a balanced sort of discussion amongst the panelists. So you guys are now free to move to your places amongst the distinguished panel. So do we have any questions to start with? Yeah, go ahead.
Stand up, ask the questions.
So with social media, there is this approach from Facebook on how to use algorithms to determine when someone may be suicidal, for example. But I don't know how much the academy or the individuals that know this part of the brain or these functionalities would agree on what constitutes someone who is potential suicidal by just looking at social media, or what they post or what they write.
That sounds like a good, for Bob to start off.
To write an algorithm, you need some agreement on to funnel then those things that become true. So if there is no agreement on what is true, then it's difficult to write an algorithm. That's my point.
So could everyone hear the question?
Just to,
Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good start. So the question was, there are lots of different algorithms that are being used, particularly in some of the mega search engines like Google. One of the apps that has popped up may be used to predict who is at risk for committing suicide based on their social media posts and comments. And the question really is, does it work? Is it useful? And, you know, like so many things, we're coming up with now a field that's called predictive analytics, or using data to understand what people are likely going to do in the future based on information that's available today. And like so many different things, it is based on the quality of the data. A lot of it, frankly, we just don't know yet. But there are, you know, going back to what Stephen had said just a little while ago, or actually, I'm sorry, what Mike had said, we're undergoing this huge social experiment now, where we're raising generations who are exposed to technology that we don't know what the consequence of that's going to be. Same thing with this kind of algorithmic predictive analytics. These companies now have access to data on literally billions of people. Billions of people. They can cross-reference lots of different databases. They actually can check, should they choose to do so, obituaries in newspapers. They can cross-reference different kinds of data to be able to see who acted on a suicide attempt, who completed a suicide, and then retroactively access what were their Twitter posts, what were their feeds into YouTube. And so to the degree that they can actually bring all of that together is the degree to which they may be able to predict behaviors on the basis of data we've never had access to before. So we don't know yet whether that will work or not, but clearly they're really good at predicting our buying strategies and linking up what we looked at, how much time our mouse might hover over something from a computer, how much time we spend on any given page or item, and by that predicting what kinds of things we're going to likely buy. So the short answer is right now I would expect the analytics are not that great, but in 4 to 10 years they're likely going to improve dramatically.
Thanks for the question. And we have another one up above.
Yeah, I'm curious as to what you think the future of spoken communication is.
Anyone want to
Spoken.
try that? Well, so the question was, what do we think the future of spoken communication is? And I'll just say a couple words and see if that prompts the kind of right direction or not, and you can steer us in a different direction if that wasn't quite to your point. One of the things I've noticed is that things like texting actually may take away our grammar. So, you know, I tend to text in a very kind of foreign sort of voice to myself now, and I have forgotten how to punctuate sentences and all kinds of things because I'm texting. I will use, though, voice to text quite a bit recently. So I think that my feeling is that we're kind of in a lull right now in terms of technology and technological capabilities, but what we're seeing with touchscreens and voice to text is probably a next wave of much more intuitive computing interfaces. Since the beginning of computers, punch cards and mice and keyboards, we've had a very awkward relationship where we kind of have to fit with the limitations of the technology. I think we're at a point where spoken words and languages and gestures are actually going to be more incorporated into the technology. I don't know if that hits upon part of your question, and I don't know if that prompts any other comments.
So, Stephen,
I have one of these.
can I
Yeah.
just ask you to comment on something else? So
Yeah.
I'll moderate to you for a second.
Sure.
So it seems to me this is a great opportunity as an expert for you to comment on, going back to your first slides. We know human brain is wired evolutionarily to read a broad band of communication. We all look at people's facial expressions, their body language. We don't just listen to their words, and we listen to the intonation of the words. When you do your rather impoverished
He's going to ask me a
texting,
hard question now.
Yeah. When you do your impoverished texting, even with the emojis and all that stuff,
Yeah.
without that on there, what is the danger we run as the receiver of not interpreting correctly unless we can get into your mind, your intonation, your context, and how important is it for our brain to have that multimodal or broad band of communication versus the very narrow digital communication?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think that technology that we have so far was kind of a convenience. You know, having a telephone is a great thing. Being able to text is a great thing. But being in person with a room being in person in the same room, going to scientific meetings even is a very important part of things. And in terms of how I think we're wired, I don't know all the details of this, but there are ideas about things like mirror neurons and watching people and simulating that yourself. And you know, I think that we are wired to be social creatures, and I think that currently the technology limits that, and the ability to kind of live in avatar space and virtual reality is starting to kind of move towards that direction, but I think we're a long way off.
Some others want to comment on that?
I guess I just want to comment from my perspective. I don't know that we speak to each other less. I feel like the types of opportunities for spoken communication have just changed. You know, I have greater access to audiobooks, for example, and so that's a form of spoken communication. And people are watching videos where they would have had to read before. So I think things have changed, but I don't know if the balance between the spoken word and the written word has necessarily changed. And just like kids are texting now, I mean, I recall being a kid and slipping notes in my friend's locker. So, you know, we've all written, and I wouldn't say that my life is lacking the spoken communication. But maybe our teenager can comment on that.
So I do text a lot with my friends to keep in touch with them, maybe when I don't see them at school, but I do talk with them a lot as well.
Put your mic closer, Mike.
So in person, so spoken communication is definitely not going away. It's still very important to be, because when you're speaking in person, like Stephen I think was saying, or maybe Mike, you have to interpret the gestures and the body language. So, and that's lost with the texting. You need spoken communication so you can preserve that.
There's someone right in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you.
How does electronics make your eyes burn and damage your brain?
Did you hear that? Could you say it one more time? That was.
Stand up.
Oh, okay.
How do electronics damage your brain and make your eyes red?
Oh, how does electronics damage your brain and make your eyes red? Well, one thing that I did want to talk about was the light coming out of electronics. So I wonder, Audra, if you'd like to
Right.
just say a few
So
words.
this doesn't necessarily get at why it makes your eyes red. That's really because you've been staring at the screen too long. But there are a lot of things that make our eyes red. But yeah, why don't I talk a little bit about blue light? Because regardless of the content that's on the screen that you're looking at, they're all going to have a similar negative effects on the brain. I just want to throw a question out to the audience, though, first. How many of you have either a television or a computer or keep a cell phone in your bedroom or sleep environment at night? Okay. And how many of you use one of those devices just before you go to bed? All right. Well, so I'm going to take a minute to tell you why that's bad and to answer the question. But first, I just want to say you're not alone. So Stephen had some statistics that were up on the screen, and there's actually also a National Sleep Foundation study about 5 years ago that found that 72% of children and 89% of teenagers have at least one device in their bedroom or sleep environment, and that the majority of them use it just before bed. And the reason this is bad is because these devices produce blue light. They're strong producers of blue light, and blue light is a strong regulator of our circadian rhythms. So does anybody know what circadian rhythms are? Does someone want to raise their hand and just shout something out?
Day and night.
What's that?
Day and night.
Day and night, right. It's our biological rhythms that control our sleep and wake cycle. We also have appetite hormones that are regulated by our circadian rhythms. There are the gene expression in our body is also regulated on a 24-hour rhythm. So for most of us, the circadian rhythms are around 24 hours, but for some of us, they're a little bit more. Some of us, it's a little bit less. So we need to kind of entrain that rhythm based on external cues, and those are predominantly light and dark. And so a couple of hours before we go to bed, there's a tiny pea-sized gland in our brain called the pineal gland, and that secretes a hormone called melatonin that basically makes us a little bit sleepy, makes it easier for us to fall asleep. And when we look at these devices close to bedtime, it postpones that production of melatonin. And so ultimately, what ends up happening is we end up with a poorer sleep quality. It may take us longer to fall asleep, and we'll get less sleep. So any of you who have kids know what the short-term effects are if your children don't get enough sleep. And over the long term, those changes can get worse. So things like impulsivity and just trouble regulating emotions. And studies have shown that actually there was a large-scale meta-analysis of over 100,000 teenagers, average age 14, that found that there's a strong association between using devices just before bed and poor sleep quality, as well as increased daytime sleepiness. So in the long run, what this can lead to is greater risk for things like depression, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. So what is the moral of the story? Well, I know that none of us are going to stop using our devices 3 hours before bedtime, which is what we should really be doing. But trying to minimize use of those devices is probably going to have much beneficial effects. But it's not going to destroy our brain. It might make our eyes a little bit red. So you don't have to worry about that. But trying to lay off the use of electronics right before bed is a good thing.
Is the spectrum of light that does that? Would black and white change that?
So there's still blue light if you're watching a black and white television. It's really hard to filter those low wavelength light out of your devices. There are some apps you can download that reduce how much blue light is emitted, but things like fluorescent lights, like all of the energy efficient bulbs, they all have blue light. So we can't change that.
Maybe two of the other panelists, I'd be curious to know, both Bob, based on psychiatric disorders, Dr. Trestman, based on what Dr. Van Wart just said, maybe you can comment on some of that relationship to sleep disruption. And also, Sheila, in terms of what's going on with libraries and things that are giving kids other opportunities to engage them, what are some innovative ways that you can help maybe break that cycle? It'd be interesting to hear from other panelists about that too.
We do know and have known for years that a full night of sleep is of enormous value for mental health. It's not in any way ambiguous. The data is overwhelming. Ideally, people need a minimum of 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep each night. If you're younger, ideally 8 to 9 hours as a teenager. And if you're younger yet, even more. So why is that? We have internal clocks that not just are involved in awake and sleep, but also regulating our dream state, our activity levels, and really helping our ability to integrate the experience of the past day, to consolidate the memories, to be able to express and to integrate all of the emotional, both highs and lows that we've experienced. When you interrupt that, it makes it extremely difficult for us to both regulate ourselves and, as children and teenagers, to grow. As Audra had just mentioned, there are significant issues with impulsivity, impulse regulation, as well as mood regulation, frequently depression, that can occur when sleep is badly and routinely disrupted. So these are some of the real challenges. And keep in mind, this isn't a new issue. For those of us who are a little bit older than 30 or 40, how many of us were under the covers late at night with a flashlight reading a book or doing other things? I mean, there's so many different things that people like to do that aren't going to be in a normal regulated fashion. That doesn't mean it's an absolute yes or no. But the more we can regulate ourselves, the better we will function, the more our brains will mature appropriately, the more resilient we're going to be to the stressors in life.
So in answer to this from the library perspective, if you think back to the photos that you saw that flashed up on the screen, those are actually our libraries here in Roanoke. So I've been tasked in the last 10 years to take 1960s libraries and bring them into the future. And probably I would refer to the photo, or if you've been to the main library, is the most dramatic way I would explain it. So you have a bank of computers that you can see for both teens and children in the children's area. And we have over 200 computers in the library. And yet, right in the middle of that is a slide. Now, this was something very deliberately done by us because we are very into what we call active play. And I tease my staff that I used to lay in the grass and count clouds and didn't think I was wasting my time when I was 10 years old. You kind of want to have that, as well as have children that are able to use technology to do well in school, to also do well in getting a job in the future. So to ignore technology is not the answer. So what you're seeing there is a balance between letting your child have an imagination, active play, and also having a place where people that do not have access to the internet, and we have numerous families that tell us they do not subscribe to the internet because we have wireless at all our libraries, and they use that as a way to make ends meet. We also find children all the time that are trying to write a paper in, say, middle school on their phone, and they might have a phone, but it's not it's not a fancy phone. So we're always on the lookout for that. But balanced with that are programs, and we want to create a community center library. So probably one of our proudest moments was our Williamson Road Library. We had the middle schoolers were right near schools. They came to us and they're like, "Can we have a Scrabble club?" And so we immediately are going to the technology side thinking that's what, and they're like, no, we want the traditional Scrabble. And they almost won the Scrabble tournament a couple of years ago. They've continued that tradition to the point that when we just renovated there, we actually added the Scrabble tiles and stuff. If you have not been out there to look at, we added some of that into the motif in the teen center. We have a very large Scrabble board, and they immediately went to that. So I think part of that is just exposing them to that, exposing even adults to this sort of thing, and knowing that technology and balance of life, because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about turning the TV off. Maybe it would be nice to sit on the porch and talk to each other the hour before you go to bed. So I think it's just that balance, but I mean, technology is here to stay, so it's not to be demonized in my mind. It's how do we incorporate that into a balanced way into our life so that we can do well both with the technology, but also not forget that we can lay in the grass and look at the clouds.
Great. I'd like to get this girl up there, and then this gentleman here, and then Dominic, because they've all had their hands up for quite a while. So there was a question up here.
If you're watching like the news, does it still like hurt your brain?
I wish I wasn't on the panel. No. So the question was, if I'm watching the news, does the TV still hurt my brain? I wouldn't say that the TV hurts your brain.
Thank you for the question.
So yeah, the news, on the other hand, I guess it depends what's on the news that day. Sometimes it hurts my brain. I mean, I think this is a nice place where we can segue into that there are positives to all of our technological devices, and one of them is that we can receive the news. We can watch content that is going to help us think, help us be informed about the world. You know, the statements that I was just giving about watching TV right before bed or looking at devices right before bed, really the message there is that we need to do that in moderation and be careful when we do it. But I think it's great if you watch the news.
Great. And then, sir, you had a question?
Back to the young people and the brain. The schools today have the computer. Memorization is not near as much as it was in my day. In that's the trend more and more. Is there such a thing as muscle memory in the brain, that if you don't use it for repetition and the like, that we lose anything?
Yep. Sir.
Second little question.
Yeah.
When I go for my annual physical, to check for dementia, the doctor asked me to draw a picture of a clock and put the hand in three.
Yeah, we have to change.
If I fail, I may be headed towards dementia. If the young people that are digitally oriented can't draw the same picture, what's their problem?
Well, maybe we could start with Erik's thoughts on kind of the use of technology and the emphasis on memorization versus kind of the external memory that we all carry around in our smart devices. And do you have any thoughts on that, Erik?
So, yeah, he's right. We should still use memorization and not get rid of it entirely. Your brain, if you don't use it, you lose it. So it's still sometimes good to get back to the basics and not use the technology. But the technology is also a great tool for learning. You can use it. There's tons of information out there, anything you want to do, like you were saying with your car. Or sometimes I get curious about some topic in science or math, and I look it up. And I don't have to go find some person who's more knowledgeable. I can just find it right there on my phone, in my pocket, or on my computer. So it's still really good, as long as you don't abandon the basics with memorization.
But also keep in mind, to use technology well, you're memorizing a great deal. You're learning a great deal of process that you're going to be using repeatedly. Additionally, a lot of it can be structured. You may find that those applications on a smartphone or different programs on a computer that you really enjoy using require you to be engaged, and many of the games, those that are well designed, require you to both understand, to synthesize, to really be creative yourself. So it's not an either or. The additional element is, you know, I remember that when I was in undergraduate school and I got this wonderful device which was actually a calculator with a memory key, and it could actually remember one thing. There were complaints that we would be destroying our ability to understand, to be able to really think through processes, and give up our slide rules. Anybody else remember ever using a slide rule? I still have mine. It's a wonderful thing. But the issue really is we transition. We transition from one kind of learning to another, but we are intrinsically curious. We're intrinsically creative. And technology allows us to express that in different ways.
Sheila, do you want to talk about some of the apps that you and I have discussed recently, and then we'll ask Dominic his question.
Right. I was actually thinking, if on the table I brought a few. We call it Vroom, V-R-O-O-M. That's an interesting example of. I was thinking about it from a different perspective after Stephen and I chatted about this panel discussion this week. It's an interesting application because it's an app that you can get through the library. We have a process called, we have a campaign, a local campaign called Star City Reads. There are 300 communities in the country that are in this campaign to improve reading and have our children ready for school. And this is part of that process. Roanoke is one of 300 communities. We call our local campaign Star City Reads, and in our particular case, we're the lead on the campaign, but we have 30 community partners. In this process, they're having us pilot this app. So it's an app that you download to your phone, and they have done statistics, no matter what your demographic, most people have a phone at this point, or a lot of people have a phone. And they use that, some people use that as their computer. And we see that all the time where they'll come in and use our computer, but they've done stuff on their phone. So you download the app, and then you say what age is your child. My daughter's grown, so I put in the age of my dog. so you can play with it that way. However, what it will do is, this is an interesting thing because it's the technology, but it sends you information each day about what you can do offline with your child. So for example, it might say, are you going to the grocery store today? So you have a 2-year-old. Why don't you talk about the color of the apples? Or this, it'll talk about, when you talk about the moon, why don't you talk about a half moon and talk about, like that introduces math concepts to your child. It's really, really important, and it makes a huge difference when your child goes to school. So this is for birth to age 6. And I would also say another thing that's the most important thing that I would say in all the work we've done, if there was one thing I wanted you to walk away with, is technology can be good and bad depending on what we do as a parent. So for example, what I mean by that is if your child is crying, and let's be honest, all of us maybe have done this at some point, and in the day it might have been put them in front of the TV. They're crying, you've got to finish dinner or whatever, and you just say, go sit and calm down. That's fine, but then you're not engaging. You're on the phone. Or the same thing with your cell phone. If you just hand the phone to the child, then at that point, then the technology perhaps isn't the best it could be. So one thing that we found, particularly with Vroom, or even with our computers that we have preschool computers that we put in all of our newly renovated branches that are not connected to the internet for safety, but they're loaded up with children's scientifically proven good software for children birth to like age 7. They have a keyboard that's made for a child that can't write or read yet. They're colorful. We have had 2-year-olds sit there. We have purposely put a computer for an adult beside them, and the parents interact. So it's that interaction with your child. So if you sit down with the phone to calm them down and you're saying, oh, let's pull up something, and you're talking to, even just talking to the child, then you've got the parent engagement, and that is the single most important thing anyone can do, regardless of your education or anything else, to make sure your child is ready to learn when they go to kindergarten.
Great. Dominic?
So, back to the blue light. How effective are blue light filters on reducing the effects of blue light to your sleep?
So there's some evidence out there that there's certain kind of, they look like amber filters, they filter out a lot of the blue light, and the effects on, for example, melatonin levels are similar to being in very dim light. So they are helpful. But whether or not they cause a lot of eye strain, if it's nighttime and you're still trying to get away with using your device, I think that's still a concern. But I'm sure you'll find a way around it.
Let's go to Harsh up in the back, and then we'll do the front.
I feel like the internet itself is a huge part of why these digital devices have become a almost unavoidable thing that we need to get used to. But there are several people in the room who weren't even born when the internet was not here. So we've come to this point where every generation feels like the previous generation. What would you do with your time if you didn't have the internet? What did you even do during your day? So can the panel comment on our dependency on the internet and how it's useful, like both sides of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why don't you start?
So I have to admit, I do spend a lot of time on the internet every day, But I try not to be completely dependent on it. I play piano and violin, so I still practice those sometimes just to get away from it. Or if I want to learn math, I might have a textbook instead. And also with the internet, it's really easy to be distracted. It can be very time consuming if you're not careful. So you might think you're learning something new, and you get distracted with the link to a video about a cat, and then it's been 2 hours, and you haven't learned anything, and you're still watching videos about cats. So you have to be careful with that as well, definitely, and get away from the internet sometimes. But it is very useful for learning as well, so in moderation.
I think there's also the challenge of just our society and culture, all the things that, I used to do when I was that age, well, maybe a little bit younger, but the society just doesn't support those kinds of things anymore. So, going outside to play, playing freeze tag for 3 hours, our kids just don't do that. Everything is organized sports. You're just less likely to, kick your kid out the door and have them go and play. So I think it's hard because our society is kind of shaping around the technology as well.
Good. So we had some questions up front.
I really enjoyed your comments about the Vroom app. And so I kind of wanted to see if you had any comments on how applications can be used in clinical practice, and also speaking to this gentleman's question about using the clock for dementia, how maybe technology might change diagnostic practice as well, please.
Great question.
For those who might not hear, the question was, how might these technologies change clinical practice? Anybody remember on Star Trek, the tricorder? Well,
yes.
Welcome to the modern world where we're going back to the 1970s for the tricorder. People are developing things like that even now. There are so many even wearable devices. The interface, think about, right now we're just talking about a smartphone, but the fact is that smartphones are now linked to implanted automatic defibrillators and cardiac pacemakers. They are hooked up to implanted insulin pumps for those with diabetes. More and more, these apps and these technologies are helping to refine and enhance human life. Diagnostically, we've already seen in publications in JAMA and other first-rank journals apps or computer programs that are at least as good at diagnosis as skilled clinicians are. So in at least certain areas and in certain diagnoses. So we are rapidly getting to a point where the technology is going to reshape how we think about and how we deliver healthcare. In rural areas, such as the Appalachians, it's going to be a profound transformation within the next 10 years as we can reach into people's homes without them having to travel for 2 hours to get to a clinic for an appointment. We will, right now, using the technology from companies like Fitbit, there are millions of people wearing these devices 24 hours a day, and these companies are collecting data on sleep patterns, on exercise, and are starting to link that up to medical applications. There is literally no end to the kinds of creative applications that may be of value. And so the real challenge is we're going through a period of exploration and trying to figure out what works, what's relevant, what's valuable, and what isn't. So we're going to have a lot of failures over the next decade of technologies that really don't work and aren't of real value, but we're going to have a lot of amazing successes that will evolve. And as far as the clock drawing, it's just going to change. It will simply be another picture that you will be shown and then asked to recall a few minutes later, or asked to create something and to see if you can synthesize it. Because sadly, I think a lot of kids are not going to be able to do analog clock time in the years ahead.
It's the only thing that makes me feel good is knowing I can do something they can't.
Well, you can still know how to dial a phone, too.
I have one of them.
So I think Mike wanted to make a comment, and then Amna's going to ask a question, and Jeff, and then I think we'll have to segue into Audra's closing remarks.
So to your question before, I can't resist. I'm going to be the biologist in the room. You asked about repetition. Actually, there's a lot of good evidence on the biology of the importance of it. It was first discovered in a creature called a sea slug by a very famous psychiatrist who won the Nobel Prize for studying sea slugs and how memories form in the brain of a sea slug. And what was found was the more you repeated a stimulation, the more it changed the ability to change the expression of genes from the DNA in the nerve cells in the sea slug to form long-term stable memories. That was then discovered, the same thing in a mouse, and we now know it happens in humans. So we do know that repetition per se accesses biological mechanisms to harden and make more permanent memories. So your question, I think, is a very good one. And with respect to using, relying on algorithms and things on the phones, if you're not using that, might you lose it? Yes. But I think Dr. Trestman made the good point. That'll be incorporated in the technologies as well. It's not an either or, but there is a very important biological need for repetition. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
There's, along those lines, just there was a study that showed that if individuals were aware that that information that they learned was going to be easily accessible someplace else, they were less likely to be able to recall that information later. So you have to make that conscious effort to not take for granted the fact that you can look up that information later. You have to repeat that.
Great. Okay, so 2 quick questions and then maybe some concise answers from the panel because we've got about 8 more minutes.
So my question actually relates to the first question, kind of on the other side of the spectrum of being able to diagnose someone who's at risk of committing suicide. How do we address ethical concerns of these third-party like apps having access to medical information that would otherwise be private? How do we kind of make it so that it's hard, like that it's not possible for, let's say, an employer or a financial institution to use information that is medically relevant against people?
Let me condense a 5-hour conversation into just 2 sentences. In short, our society has not begun to address that. When you go to a physician who is working these days, there are formal legal boundaries about protected health information, but there are many, many issues. For example, if you are at risk for a genetic disorder like Huntington disease, and you get tested for that, you will never thereafter, if you're positive for Huntington's, you won't be able to get many forms of insurance. You won't be able to get disability insurance. So there are many things that can be used against you in that context, particularly if it is in the hands of others. 23andMe sounds like it's a lot of fun. It's great, but you're providing knowledge to other organizations that are then going to be using that for-profit purposes unrelated to anything you originally anticipated.
And just maybe I can add just really briefly, even though I'm trying to be concise, Mike has asked me to talk about cybersecurity. I would also make a plug for us to decide as a society what we want to be that and to be active citizens and be engaged, because we do have a chance to actually shape the culture. So, you know, we need to decide as a society how we value our privacy and how that will relate to things like that. And I think that's very important. In the meantime, there are a lot of technologies to help maintain privacy. There are a lot of regulations related to HIPAA and health information about people. But we need to, beyond that technology, I think as a society, we need to decide what we want, and we have to decide it as active citizens and really vote and change the political landscape.
Considering that as we age and new generations come online and get more adapted to giving away more and more types of information, there may be some point where
sure. There are
that
generational
bar is gonna
differences
change.
in those norms, yeah.
Notice Audra said, as new generations come online.
Yeah, as they boot up, as these new organisms boot. Jeff, you had one, and then let's close with Audra's comments.
So, as my good friend Dominic prefaced his question, I'd like to go back to the blue light. So earlier we were discussing some of the harmful effects of blue light. You mentioned its disruption of the circadian rhythm, and I know that a lot of cancer research, and in particular breast cancer research, with nurses who work night shifts having a higher incidence, there's a relationship between the disruption of the circadian rhythm and a higher incidence of cancer, breast cancer. So I'm wondering, this disruption that occurs from the blue light, do we think that is strong enough to also have implications in development of cancer or not?
That hasn't been proven. I think what we're talking about here with the blue light is smaller shifts in our circadian rhythm that are going to affect our appetite and affect our sleep-wake cycle. I think some of the literature you're referring to is a little bit on the more extreme end of the spectrum, where you're talking about people that are working the night shift and that are exposed all night long to fluorescent lighting and computers. So in my opinion, based on the current knowledge, I wouldn't necessarily be worried about that, but it's a good question.
Great. So do you want to say a few summary words?
Sure. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out here tonight. This was a great discussion. I'm sorry I scared the children. But I think just to kind of summarize, what we've been talking about, there are many positive effects of technology. There are many benefits that the generations coming online are getting to take advantage of, and our society is changing in a way to embrace those and try to promote the most advantageous uses of that technology. But I think we've also talked about some of the pitfalls that we have to be aware of, both in terms of the physical effects of the technology on our health and on our brains, as well as what we have to do to keep our information safe and to keep our children safe and their mental well-being safe. And does anyone else on the panel have any final words they'd like to put out? No? Any advice from our teenager? Advice for the parents?
So, yeah, like they were saying, there's many possible risks with the technology, but if you use it correctly, it has great potential for learning. There's all kinds of information. I already said it before, but really a lot of the programming that I learned most of it online. I'm curious about something, I look it up, and so you should supervise probably where your kids go so they don't waste too much time, but if you use it correctly, it's very powerful, lots of potential for learning. So more programming, fewer cats. All right. Cats in moderation.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I would say I like the cat as long as it's in a controlled, not 3 hours, because I think at the heart of what is missing, or that I worry about all the time, is imagination and allowing kids to have an imagination. So we deliberately do story tiles and have kids write stories and do poetry slams. And I think that that's something that everyone enjoys. And I think looking at the cat video could be fun. We could talk about a story with that. How about that? You could write a story for us. So I just think using the imagination and not losing that, because I think that's something we could lose if we're not careful.
Right. So it's very powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. Quote Spider-Man. All right.
Great.
So please join me in thanking our panel for a really collaborative And I'd like everybody in the audience to give themselves a hand for